7:35 in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, how did you like that image of the night sky? Cloudy and so on, total blackness with the absence of any stars or the full moon or anything like that. We apologize. That was just an error on our part. I'm trying to cover it up as best as I can, but it's a miserable effort in that regard. But we're going to continue our conversation now on gender-based violence. Today, we're focusing on the role of the work environment. Are there mechanisms for identifying such instances? Well, we have with us here live in studio, we're joined by Michael Anisette, General Secretary of the National Trade Union Center, President of the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union, and via Zoom we're joined as well by Ronald Ramlogan, Team Lead in Public Relations and Research of the Employers Consultative Association. He should be joining us shortly. We already have with us Stephanie Fingal, Interim CEO of the ECA, and we also have with us Dennis Zulu, who is the Director of the International Labour Organization Decent Work Team and Office for the Caribbean. Good morning to all. If I could ask Ms. Fingal, even as we're live on air, just to tilt her camera down a little bit, because she's looking as if she's speaking from almost the bottom of her desk, because we can only see her head at this time. So I'm sure she's going to sort that out now as we have the conversation. Mr. Anisette, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us in studio. Before we engage our guests who are also with us via Zoom, tell us about your own perspective when we talk about gender-based violence in the workplace. What is your perspective on that?
Well, from a trade union perspective, it's a serious problem. It's a real problem. It's not a problem that you can sweep under the carpet, but the ILO would have done what I want to call global standards as it relates to violence in the workplace. And its Convention 190 and recommendations 206, I guess that Mr. Zulu going to elaborate on it. But we in the trade union movement believe we have a responsibility. We cannot just be responsible for collective bargaining, but all social issues must fall under our radar. And that is one of the most serious issues that we have. It's not only in the workplace, I must say, but it's even at the homes, because when a work is affected by what is happening at home, they bring that problem into the workplace. And sometimes we need to understand what is causing the behavioral patterns of the workers. And sometimes we do not understand. So that we are thankful to the UNFPA and also the ILO, and let me say Cipriani Labour College, which we have partnered with in order to do a series of programs that speaks to how do we identify in the workplace those issues, what kind of format do we put in place, what kind of processes do we put in place, how do we engage the employer to address such a critical and serious issue that is affecting Trinidad and Tobago. And as I speak to you, we are rolling out a program at Cipriani College today, for over 100 representatives from the workplace, so that they will be better educated and much more appreciative and be able to, address some of the telltale signs and the issues that may arise coming out of violence in the workplace.
Well, let's engage our guests who are joining us via Zoom as well. Mr. Zulu, Director of the ILO's Decent Work Team and Office of the Caribbean. What context do you bring to a discussion like this? Good morning to you, Mr. Zulu.
Morning to you too. Well, thanks for having us on this program. As you know, the Trinidad and Tobago is a member of the International Labour Organization and has been a member for a while now. And you'll listen that from Mr. Anissette's presentation that the ILO actually is responsible globally for international labour standards. Excuse me. And in 2019, recognizing the seriousness of the problem, the ILO did pass what we call a Convention 190, which goes beyond just gender-based violence, but looks at harassment and violence in the workplace. And within this, the whole discussion on gender-based violence, physical violence, and sexual violence is all covered fairly clearly. So what the ILO does is that with the prescription of these international conventions, member states then ratify these conventions, and the conventions provide guidance as what should be done at the national level. At the moment, since it's a fairly new convention, we are working very closely with member states, including Trinidad and Tobago, to see how this convention can be ratified. Because the importance of ratifying a convention is that it actually enables the member states to put the provisions of the convention into national law. And the convention itself is supported by what we call a recommendation. And the recommendation 206 is fairly helpful in that it provides the necessary guidelines in what has to be integrated into national law. So for instance, the recommendation will basically cover 3 issues. First of all, protection and prevention, enforcement, remedies and assistance, and lastly, it looks at guidance, training, and awareness raising. So all these issues are very important in terms of gender-based violence, but also looking at the wider spectrum of harassment and violence in the workplace. Now, you might ask why then did the ILO get involved in this? But we do recognize, just like Mr. Anas had stated here, that violence and harassment in the workplace has really grown, and most recently, with COVID and restrictions placed on individuals and as part of the measures put in place to prevent the spread of COVID. A report from UN Women, for instance, last year stated that there had been over 240 million incidents of gender-based violence across the world. And this for us is of serious concern. And you know that whatever happens in the community, basically the workplace mirrors that. So if you see an increase in violence in the communities, this then cascades down into workplace, because ultimately, I mean, the workers who come to workplace do come from these communities, do face the same difficulties and challenges, are subject to the same issues affecting the communities, poverty, alcoholism, and all these other issues that make violence very possible. So it's important, therefore, that as the ILO, we provide a framework with member states can then adopt at the national level, looking at the local circumstances, and use this as a way of moving forward towards implementing policies, legislation, and programs to mitigate this very important and very difficult challenge of gender-based violence and violence in the workplace.
Very challenging indeed. And let's bring in Ms. Fingal now, Interim CEO of the ECA, the Employers Consultative Association. From an employer's point of view, Ms. Fingal, just give me your perspective as far as hearing all of the conventions and what needs to be ratified and what should be implemented, what is and so on. What is your perspective as far as the state of play on the ground for employers in Trinidad and Tobago when it comes to gender-based violence?
Fazir, we talk about gender-based violence and harassment. And while we don't normally hear of a fatal attack on a female in the workplace by a colleague, we do have attacks on females physically, yes, sometimes, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and I would like to add economically, and even at tertiary level institutions, so it's academically as well. So women face this sort of abuse, because really it's all about abuse, it's about power. And we have heard about that for years and years and years. And while we will have all these, we have the recommendations, the conventions and so on, something practical has to be done. Organizations, employers, and sometimes employers themselves might be the perpetrator. So what you would find is that there must be something external to the workplace. We have an OSH Act that deals with health, safety, and well-being of employees. And gender-based violence and harassment affects the well-being of employees. So from a legal point of view, we have some sort of legislation that can address that. But often that is ignored and people don't see it in that perspective. So we really need for employers to see it differently, for employers to insist and develop policies among their employees to understand that it is a breach of legislation, apart from the personal humiliation and degradation of women that we are dealing with every single day. And what we find is that there is this propensity normally for gender-based violence and harassment to be against the most vulnerable in society. So we have those who are economically impacted, those who earn the least, as Director Zulu said. COVID-19 has brought that out, as well as we have persons who might themselves be already having difficulty in their homes and are seen as easy targets by very senior people in organizations. And in some organizations, I am aware, if that were to occur, it would be an automatic dismissal of that senior person. In others, it is probably lauded and applauded. So we do have a social understanding as well to change a shift in our mindset and to really see women. You know, we say all men are created equal. Maybe we need to say all people are created equal. so that women are included as well and have their rightful place, the respect, the regard that they must have, not denied a promotion because they will not concede to whatever is being asked of them and those sorts of things. So it's a multi-pronged approach. We have legislation from the USH perspective. We have the conventions and so to be ratified, workplace policies developed and all of that, but there must be actual application and organizations must be prepared to take decisive action. As the ECA, we intervene in several situations. And sometimes you might have a little, it's not very clear and they are able to resolve it. It's misunderstanding or perhaps a little, people being a little bit too liberal in the workplace. But other times it's very real. And we believe that the time has come for that to stop.
And if I could come back to Mr. Anisette here in studio with us, and because it's such an involved topic, but we have so little time, are you satisfied that we are moving in the right direction, Mr. Anisette, as far as dealing with something that could be very subjective, that it could be like, well, she say, he say, or she say, I do that, but me do nothing. What's she talking about? She just out to get me fired. That kind of context, Mr. Anisette.
No, well, you will always find that, but the issue, as I said, that we are educating the workforce. The Employers Consultative Association is involved in it and they have their responsibility. And I think that if you educate women, and more particularly men, all right, we will be able to do the transformation that is necessary in the society for us to understand that any form of violence whatsoever against women, against children, even against men, is something that we should not tolerate. So that if we start with that narrative and if we inculcate that kind of thinking and development even within the home space, within schools, I believe that we'll be able to do the transformation that is necessary, because we're dealing with a socialized problem. We're dealing with a problem where it's a cultural thing. You know, the man is boss, and whatever I say goes. So it's an educational process that we are talking about that we believe that
that's why I asked you.
That will do the yes, it is. And then the fact, the fact that we have partnered with the UNFPA and also the ILO and the ECA and NATUC. And we have collaborated with Cipriani Labour College to bring the kind of studies and academic framework to the workplace and to the shop steward is demonstrative of the fact that we recognize we have a role to play. We recognize that this is a serious problem. And the only way to do that transformation is by educating our workers and changing the narrative from this machoism that seems to be a cultural thing within our society, not only in Trinidad, but across the Caribbean region.
And many other regions of the world for that matter as well. Well, we also have another guest, as I mentioned in our introduction, Ronald Ramlogan, who is the team lead in public relations and research at the ECA. Mr. Ramlogan, who is here with us, and even as time is going by so very quickly, we wanted to get your perspective, Mr. Ramlogan. What is your own view on this issue of gender-based violence, which could actually start with harassment in the workplace, or harassment in the workplace?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vizier. And let me just say that I agree with what has been said before. Given my role at the ECA, I always like to look at what the data says. And I recall a 2018 survey that was conducted by the Inter-American Development Bank, a woman's health survey in Trinidad and Tobago. And it found that 1 in 3 women and girls who are in relationships in TNT have experienced some sort of abuse, whether sexual or physical. And when we look at the workplace, the data really was very sparse. So we would have conducted some preliminary research as part of our role within what Mr. Anisette referred to as the Spotlight Project. And what we found was that just about 80% or so of our members who responded to the survey, 84%, did not have a policy in place in respect of family violence. 73% did not have a policy in place in respect of gender-based violence. And when we looked at training, the training aspect in terms of managers, supervisors, even employees, only 19% of respondents so far indicated that their managers and supervisors, even the HR staff, would have been exposed to training and sensitization on this issue. of gender-based violence, family violence, or even sexual harassment. And 27% reported exposing their employees to similar types of training. So there's a lack in the workplace in terms of sensitization and education. It has to start there. Of course, employers must take a policy position. There must be buy-in from the top down and demonstration of adherence to that policy. And we do encourage workplaces to have mechanisms in place to deal with those issues in a very forceful and complete way to avoid repeat of these issues happening in the workplace again.
And Mr. Zulu, from your perspective, our final perspective from you, sir, are you confident that the existing, whether we're talking legislation or conventions or ILO resolutions, whatever they may be, however they are worded, that they are getting the buy-in that we're talking about our Caribbean region in particular. Are you satisfied, Mr. Zulu, that these are being taken on board by the various agencies, whether government, private sector, and so on, in a place like Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, yes. Well, let me say this. There's quite a bit of work that needs to be done. The convention that specifically refers to harassment in the workplace is fairly new, only 2 years old. We're trying to get as many countries as possible to ratify this, is focusing on the Caribbean, which my office is responsible for. But I think, as Ms. Fingal said, there is already existing provisions in different parts of pieces of legislation in Trinidad, which can be used for these purposes. But the difference is that the conventions we refer to are really designed for the workplace. And hopefully, once this is taken on board, we should be able to see some progression in the fight against gender-based violence. Let me just say here also that the collective agreement, which is really a very important piece of paper, which is agreed between the employer and the employee, is very important, because you can actually use this, the employer and the employee can use this as a guideline in terms of how to put in place measures that will prevent harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace. So it's very important, therefore, that in discussing or agreeing on these collective agreements, issues of gender-based violence and other forms of harassment are actually put in these collective agreements, because then it becomes a binding agreement between the employer and the employee. So this is domesticated at the enterprise level, and this is a very important piece of agreement. But going forward, we're very hopeful and looking at what has been done by the different governments in the Caribbean, including Trinidad and Tobago, but as well as the employers and workers' organizations. We cannot ignore this very challenging situation. We have to put our heads together and work towards ensuring that our women, our young people, and all the vulnerable groups are really protected in the workplace.
And a final perspective from Ms. Fingal, excuse me. Are you confident that we are moving in the right direction here in Trinidad and Tobago as far as gender-based violence and harassment in the workplace?
I think we are off to a good start this year, and we must remember that this is a very sensitive issue. So that when you have a vulnerable woman who is being harassed or physically abused also in the workplace, that person is intimidated already. And particularly when it's a power struggle, a senior and a junior. So what we really need to do, while we will implement the policies and we would, educate the employees, and so there must be that safety, that protection for that person, so that they must understand that if they report it, because a lot of times they are afraid to report it because of some sort of repercussions. And those repercussions could be their life, their livelihood, and sometimes even family issues associated with that. So there must be some mechanism, some assurance, something that will allow this individual, whoever it is, male or female, being harassed, but we know is more female, to be able to make that report and be confident that they will not have to lose their jobs or face other humiliation in the workplace. Because often too, it's a very sensitive thing to talk about. There must be some sort of psychological support. So a lot of organizations do not have EAPs, do not have counselors available. Those things must be put in place as well, so that those persons who are quote unquote the victims can have the kind of psychological and counseling that they need to feel strong enough, and even to survive after having made that report, to continue in a workplace where sometimes things get out and it's public knowledge. Those things affect people. So we have to have, alongside the legislation, alongside the policies, alongside the education, that psychological social support for those who are exposed.
Ms. Fingal, we have to leave it there. Unfortunately, time has run out on an issue that is so very involved. And I know Mr. Anisat shaking his head already because he has so much information that he wants to provide. Mr. Anisat, thank you very much as well. Ms. Fingal,
Pleasure
Mr.
is always
Ramlogan,
mine.
and of course, Mr. Zulu from the ILO. Well, here, excuse me, I don't know where this happened, where this came from, but here we have an image captured in Manzanilla, some of you commonly refer to as the book junkie, and this was submitted by Sanjay Ramroop of Claxton Bay. And now for Sunrise, captured by Gregory in Ottawa in Mayaro, as we go to the break.